very good afternoon. Wamkelekile, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We are very, very excited to have Professor Jane Macnaughton here with us, as well as Dr. Shisomo Kalenga. My name is Dr. Carla Sampiris. I'm a senior lecturer in Medical Health Humanities in the Primary Healthcare Directorate at the University of Cape Town, and one of the organizing team of the Breathe, Inspire, Expire Symposium, along with Professor Nolwazi Makwanazi from WISER and Ms. Charlotte Fasaki, who has kept us sane, together, organized and on track throughout the last 4 weeks of this process. I would like to introduce both Jane, who will be delivering our keynote address, and Shisomo, who will start off our discussions this afternoon. So it is, and I say this genuinely, an honor to introduce Jane, who will be delivering this afternoon's keynote entitled The Breath of Degradation, Why is Breathlessness Invisible? Jane is a Professor of Medical Humanities at Durham University in the United Kingdom and the Director of the university's Institute for Medical Humanities. After her initial degree in history and English, she studied medicine and was Dean of Undergraduate Medicine at Durham until the medical program transferred to Newcastle in 2017, and she's now a professor in the Department of Anthropology. Jane has been centrally involved in the development of medical humanities in the UK since 1998. She was part of the working group that set up the Association for Medical Humanities in 2001, and she established the Northern Network for Medical Humanities Research in 2013. She currently holds 2 awards from the Wellcome Trust, a development grant for the Institute for Medical Humanities, and a Senior Investigator Award for her project, The Life of Breath, which of course is one of the key reasons why Jane's input is so interesting to us as part of a symposium dedicated to breath and breathing. The Life of Breath project involves colleagues from literary studies, anthropology, history, philosophy, clinical medicine, and neuroscience, and aims to use this compound disciplinary power to influence management in chronic breathlessness. And some of those experiences have been shared by participants throughout the course of the symposium. Jane's research broadly focuses on the idea of the symptom, its initial appearance, development, and evolution in connection with medical habits, contexts, and technologies. She also continues to be clinically active and is an honorary consultant in obstetrics and gynaecology at the University Hospital of North Durham. After Jane's address, Dr. Shisomo Kalenga, a Wellcome Trust Medical Humanities Fellow at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh, will be opening our discussions. Shisomo's work can also be seen on the symposium website, and Shisomo is one of the founding members of the Malawi Medical Humanities Network and one of our regional members for the Medical Health Humanities Africa Network. So we are delighted to have both of them with us. Jane and her team and Shisomo and her colleagues in Malawi share a very central thing. They have shaped and helped craft the field of medical and health humanities in the UK and here in very specific ways, built primarily on collaboration and critical kindness and care. My time at the IMH and also with Shisomo have shown that teams of researchers, staff, and postdocs can be generous with their time and their knowledge. And it is that sense of generosity and spirit and critical engagement that we welcome into this space and into this keynote. So we're delighted to have you both here. Jane, over to you to share with us your expertise and experience. Thank you very much.
Well, hi everybody. I shall share my screen to get going before we, and hopefully this will work. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? I'm not getting any, yeah, I'm getting some thumbs up, that's great. It's really just a great pleasure to be here. Well, be here in a sense, it's a very strange sense of being, but being here with people from all over, you know, obviously Edinburgh and South Africa, and obviously people from other parts of the world as well. It's an amazing experience. Here we are on a sort of chill but bright winter's day, and I've just been hearing about the heat in South Africa, so it's very strange to be in these different places, but a great pleasure. And it's fantastic that Carla and all the colleagues over there have been setting up this symposium. One advantage, of course, of the current circumstances is that we are all able to kind of join with each other across these places. But the disadvantage of not actually being present is that, of course, sometimes it's difficult to kind of be there in the time that you need to be there. So I feel kind of slightly frustrated that I haven't managed to come to more of the symposium. And I hope that what I'm saying today doesn't necessarily repeat too much of what's been said before, but I hope it bears that repeating. So breath obviously is something that's been very much on my mind in the last few years as I've been running this project called The Life of Breath. And there's, you can see the kind of diagram that we have, the different disciplines that have been involved in the project, and myself with my co-investigator, Javi Carroll, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bristol. And I'm sure most of you know a bit about medical humanities, but Life of Breath is a medical humanities project. And by that, I mean it recognizes that health and illness are influenced by many things, not just the biomedical or pathological, but influences that happen to us in our lives, in our background context, religious, cultural, imaginative, ethnic origins. The medical humanities approach here, as you can see, enables us to gather a team of researchers from across disciplines to understand breathlessness from a wider perspective than clinical medicine alone could do. And at the outset, it was important for us to identify what kinds of problems clinicians might be having with this issue that is difficult to maybe answer from within that biomedical perspective. And one issue was this notion of symptom discordance, the idea that if you measure lung function and ask somebody how their breathlessness feels, the two things don't necessarily match up. And why is that? Well, it's because not just our bodies that determine our experience of breathlessness, but also our minds, including our thoughts, emotions, memories, imaginations, beliefs. And that signals another key aspect of the study of breath that's strongly signaled in this symposium, and that is that it's both a critical source and signal of life, as well as a cogent metaphor for marginalization, oppression, and invisibility. In respect to this project is, of course, especially prescient as it's finishing it at a time when the world's convulsed by this virus, whose most dangerous effect is that it takes away our breath, with many other symptoms as well. COVID-19 is devastating families, driving economies and businesses to ruin, and radically transforming the way we all live, work, and relate to each other. And during the peak of the pandemic in April and May this year, I was doing some extra work in my unit at the hospital here in Durham, in the northeast of England. And I spoke to many clinicians who were working closely at the coalface with people very ill and dying with COVID. And one young doctor in particular gave the impression of being overwhelmed by the need and distress of these patients. And that was something that at the outset, actually, of my own clinical career, really stayed with me as a young doctor working in accident emergency in Glasgow in Scotland in the late 80s. It was the people presenting with breathlessness that really stayed with me. These were men and women from the east end of Glasgow, from a really notorious area called the Gorbals, who'd smoked all their lives, had exacerbations of this condition, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and they were characterized by this massive focus on the need to breathe. They didn't even seem distressed. Their whole being was focused on just that need to draw air in and out of their lungs. And so currently, our COVID-oriented concerns about breath have gained metaphorical force this May, when, as you all know, the dreadful killing of George Floyd through the compression of his neck by a policeman for 8 minutes. And his final words, "I can't breathe," echoing those of Eric Gardner, have become a rallying call for the new anti-racist movement, Black Lives Matter, that's really galvanized people across the globe, despite the COVID epidemic, to get out and protest. And breath and its lack seems more than ever something that signals both the ways in which we as humans are united, but also how we are different. This "we're all in it together" has become a common statement of solidarity between politicians, but COVID-19 has really demonstrated clearly how unalike and how unequal our society is. And I think this slide of the impact of COVID on the BME population in England will demonstrate how clearly that is. Some are more equal than others, some are more vulnerable than others. I know that you've had my colleague Arthur Rose contributing to this symposium, and Arthur's work demonstrated the place breath holds, not just as a cogent metaphor for breath, but for colonial oppression as well, signaling this actually significant increased death for the BME population. And this role of breath has been poetically expressed by the Cameroon philosopher Achille Mbembe in his short essay, The Universal Right to Breathe. And in this essay, Mbembe concludes, before this virus, humanity was already threatened with suffocation. If war there must be, it cannot so much be against a specific virus as against everything that condemns the majority of humankind to a premature cessation of breathing, everything that fundamentally attacks the respiratory tract, everything that, in the long reign of capitalism, has constrained entire segments of the world's population, entire races, to a difficult, panting breath and life of oppression. To come through this constriction would mean that we conceive of breathing beyond its purely biological aspect, and instead as that which we hold in common, that which by definition eludes all calculation, by which I mean the universal right to breath. Breath, breathing, and lack of breath seem to be carrying a great deal of weight right now across the world. Cases of COVID are rising exponentially again in the context of the second wave. We in England here are in the midst of a second national lockdown. People are being shut away. The inequalities within our various societies are brought into sharper and sharper relief. Our project was almost over by the time the virus started having effect, but a key theme that emerged from Life of Breath was the invisibility of breathlessness. And the strange thing is that, in fact, people are still not really talking about breathlessness, except in the focused clinical sense. Major restrictions to the lives of people around the world may be in place to prevent breathlessness, but the focus of attention is not on the symptom, but rather on the ways in which lives have changed. The chokehold that is COVID-19, just like for George Floyd, still seems to be obstructing articulation of what breath means to us or how we cope with its lack. Breath is a metaphor for our times, but we still cannot explain it or talk about it. In her book, Encounters with the Invisible, Dorothy Wall talks about her experience of chronic fatigue syndrome and comments, to be seen is to have presence. The great fear of the ill is erasure. To be seen in our suffering, invisible to science, to be unseen in our suffering, invisible to science, tucked away in our bedrooms. This statement reflects much of what we discovered in our Life of Breath researches, the suffering of the breathless, the fact of social isolation, determined by physical functioning, but also by shame, leading to deliberate hiding away, the inability of clinical science to grapple with the symptom itself, rather than its underlying pathological causes, the lack of power. The phrase I used in the title of this talk, the breath of degradation, comes from Byron's play Manfred, and was spoken at the moment when Manfred plans to throw himself from a mountain, and signals the mixed sense of power and vulnerability humans feel in relation to the world. I chose it as its origin signals the global north, Anglophone orientation of our project, and you will note that in what follows. And I confess that this was deliberate, as I felt that the project, that the entire cultural experience of this issue was kind of bigger than the project was able to encompass across cultures, religions, and states. But I do think there's some universals, which I hope might resonate with what's gone before in the symposium and what you're now thinking about. So I'm going to just talk for a bit about this theme of invisibility in relation to three contexts. In relation to the body as an experiencing body, in relation to society and the social space, and in the political sphere. So taking first of all the sensory experience of breath from the perspective of the experiencer, what kind of a thing are we actually dealing with here? The sensory experience is not just about a visceral sensation, but it's something much more dynamic. Breath is difficult to describe or capture. It's difficult sometimes to say what kind of a thing it is. Is breath to be thought of as motion, as inspiration and expiration, or as a breath, a packet of air? containing oxygen, other gases and particles on inhalation, and carbon dioxide on the way out. However we think about it, breath is constantly in flux. It's impermanent, continually changing its shape and character depending on at what point in the system you happen to observe it. It's akin to the air itself, as here Steve Connor says. How does one study a substance that's everywhere? How is air to be picked out of its surroundings when air is ambience itself? How is the air to be brought before one when, oh dear, that's a repeat. I think I've repeated, forgive me, that's a mistake on the slide. So how is air to be picked out of its surroundings when air was ambience itself? So breath similarly is difficult to articulate or explain. It's central to the functioning of our bodies and culturally at the core of how religiously we imagine the soul or the very essence of life itself. One example from the Bible indicates its centrality, the act of bringing life to God, to Adam. God breathed air into his nostrils, the breath of life. And every religion's got this kind of image of breath at the center of life. The difficulty of articulation is one reason why breath might seem invisible even to the breather. For all of us who breathe, breath is brought into awareness as this sensory phenomenon. And following Drew Leder's approach in his book, The Absent Body, we might think of the first-hand experience of breath as interoceptive. So Leder describes three modalities of bodily sensation. So interoception, which refers to the sensing of the internal activities of the body; exteroception, which means the working of the five senses, taking in the external world; and proprioception, which provides information about the position of the body in space. And Leder uses as a key example of interoceptive awareness the gastrointestinal tract ingesting an apple. And we can do similar things, I think, with breath. If we inhale consciously, we might be aware of the passage of breath across our lips and our mouth. We might be aware of whether it's hot or cold. We might find our breath catching if we're out in the polluted air. And so there are various ways in which we can be aware of that process. And when you're breathless, the process is rather taken out of our hands. The autonomic system takes over to ensure the oxygen debt is repaid after running or exerting. And in the case of a person with breathing problems, other parts of the physiological system that are called into play with so-called accessory muscles, such as the muscles of the neck, and they may add additional sensory experience to the exertion and work of these muscles, supporting the chest wall as it works in a bellows-like way. But of course, most of the time, we're not really aware of these sensations. Breathing is in the background. It's usually invisible to the sensing body. But uniquely amongst internal viscera, the lungs are not part of what Leder terms the recessive body. That's the body that's outside of our conscious influence. We can take over control of our breathing. We can slow it down. We can deepen it. We can stop it for a while. And this control is really essential for the kind of activities of daily living, such as eating or speaking to you as I'm doing now, coughing or sniffing, or for specialist activities, such as playing a musical instrument or singing, or even highly specialist activities. Oops, that's not the right slide, is it? No, I missed one there. It's that one I was meaning to show you. Yeah, this like free diving. This is a picture of somebody under the ice, slightly scary. So these operations of conscious control add considerable complexity to what might determine the experience of breathlessness in normal and pathological states. Conscious control renders thoughts and feelings potentially much more influential in the case of breath, as opposed to in other visceral sensations. And I think it's possible to describe this sensory process, but it doesn't, in normal breath, it doesn't actually tell you what it's like to experience the problem of pathological breathlessness. And I turn now to my co-investigator, Harry Carroll, who herself suffers from a lung condition. And she describes the inexpressible sensation of severe breathlessness in her book, Phenomenology of Illness. And Javi says, throughout the time she was observing a friend of hers who was having a really bad breathless episode. Throughout the time I was watching my friend, I was thinking how incommunicable breathlessness is. The distress and sense of impending suffocation, the panic bubbling up in severe breathlessness, the sense of loss of control are entirely impenetrable, as invisible to the observer. Wait a minute, sorry, I just lost this. Entirely impenetrable, as invisible as the oxygen the respiratory patient's body so desperately craves. An observer can see the person standing still and panting, laboured breathing, but these do not really convey the subjective experience of severe distress. I think breathlessness is actually an important example of what the anthropologist Mark Nichter calls sensations that are experienced phenomenologically, but interpreted culturally. He says that embodiment is a dynamic process wherein past, present, and future experiences are in active interplay with how bodily sensations may feel at any one time. So we can translate this sensation that Javi talks about to one sensed by an athlete who's just run a race. The experience would be very different, although the mechanical physiological process might be quite similar, but prior experience, context, expectations of a recovery, and control in particular render these experiences very, very different. So first-person experience of breath and breathing is really deeply implicated with aspects of the invisible. Breathing, the function of hidden organs, sensed only in movement through mouth and trachea, and only as part of conscious focus. So how do we maybe move to the social context and think about the invisibilities there? Breathing is a first-person encounter with one's own body, but also very much a social phenomenon, and perhaps brought into greatest awareness in the context of interaction with others. In one sense, we all breathe each other's air, something that I think is made particularly visible in the social interaction of smokers. And here's one of my favorite films. It's Now Voyager. This is Bette Davis sharing a cigarette with Paul Heinrich. And the anthropologist Simone Dennis captured the experience of a woman she called Megan, who used her exhaled smoke plume to flirt with a potential sexual partner. And Dennis says, if I'm interested in a man, I like to blow my smoke up around the side of his face like a caress. So the mixing of visible breath emphasizes the camaraderie, social enjoyment of smokers in the context of shared central experience. And such is the intimate connection between bodies and smoking that cigarettes sometimes have been described as friends or even partners. And it's not surprising when we consider how breath constitutes the main open interaction of our bodies with the external world. Observed breath, whether exhaled smoke or breath on a cold day, marks our body's extension into the world and the body's social space. And interactions with others in that social space depend upon breath. Things like speaking, sighing, gasping, other emotional expressions. And it brings people together within a social space. It defines that ability to come together, to be recognized and be able to exchange, whether through words or unconscious outputs or unspoken outputs. So people who have problems with breathlessness are excluded from what I would call that universal community of breathers when breathing becomes dysfunctional. And it can be a very isolating experience. For those who have difficulty breathing, social life is difficult. Their breathing takes its own pattern and may be unpredictable and impossible to coordinate with that of others, as in a social interaction. And work in our Life of Breath project with British Lung Foundation Breathe Easy group members have reported the kinds of arrangements that group members make to avoid the embarrassment of being out of breath in the company of friends. So one said that she wouldn't accept lifts to social events, preferring to get there herself to the venue in time to allow her breathlessness to calm down and to be able to start chatting. And it's common for breathless people to avoid walking along the street alongside somebody else because they can't walk and chat at the same time. Others have adopted the tactic of looking in their mobile phones and stopping, pretending to look at mobile phones just to stop in the street in order to recover their breath. Another individual said that he got really ugly looks having parked his car in a disabled car parking space, because normally before he starts to walk or do any exercise, the breathlessness is not visible. So it's very, very difficult for people. On the one hand, there's a desire to appear normal and to hide the problem of the breathlessness. But on the other hand, there's resentment when people are not aware of it, because it's not a problem that's visible when people are at rest. And at one of the events we had during our project called a Breath Lab, where we had some rich conversations with people talking about breathing and breathlessness. We had clinicians, carers, researchers, and policymakers at this event. And we talked about the language of breathlessness in this particular one. And this issue of internality came up again. There was a distinction made between pain, how pain and breathlessness are communicated. One of our respondents said that there were a lot of words used to describe pain, to the character of pain, for example, sharp, dull, throbbing, burning. But when called upon to describe the character of breathlessness, it was much more difficult to objectify that sensation outside the self as something that could be described. Responses were much more fundamentally to do with a sense of being and being alive. So people would say, I just couldn't breathe. There's not enough air in the air to get the breath in, or the air was too thick, with the kinds of things people said. And work by our postdoctoral, and this was just rather similar to research done by David Nichols, who asked people about what breathlessness felt like for them, about being suffocated, about being scared and vulnerable, being watched. If you can't breathe, you can't live. And work by my other postdoc on the project, Rebecca Oxley, also revealed how living with the sensation of breathlessness becomes part of a person's biological continuity and becomes embedded in the rhythm of daily life. Pacing yourself, she says, is a way of living that life. You've got to pace yourself. I've been a fast walker, but now I've got to work out a route with benches and know that I can get between each one. And the shrinking life world, where am I most uncomfortable? In my chair. I'm not happy if I'm not safely in my chair. Then I'm just puffing and wheezing. So breath is a really important mediator of social interactions. It's a shared and taken for granted common denominator that it connects people through the exchange of words and of breath itself. And its absence, connected and in common social life, can fractured because breath and words are not possible. Turning finally to the idea of the kind of political frame, breathless people certainly in Western societies are the most marginalized in society. And one reason for that is breathlessness disproportionately affects the most disadvantaged communities. And this comes from a report by the British Lung Foundation recently, which shows that people from the poorest areas of the UK are more than twice as likely to have a lung condition. And key reasons for this obviously are smoking, which is a much higher prevalence in disadvantaged communities. But other influences in other parts of the world include indoor cooking fires, but also air pollution. If you think about it, it's not common to see somebody out in the street struggling and having to stop to catch their wet breath, or walking along with an oxygen tank. This word invisible, we don't see people with this problem out and about, is a recurrent feature of articles and papers written about invisibility. And here's one that was again produced by the British Lung Foundation on the invisible lives of people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And it is important because it shows a lot of people have not even heard of the condition. A lot of people have not heard of the condition, tend to accept their symptoms as a normal part of aging or as just somebody who smoked through their lives, and don't come forward to have investigations or diagnosis and support. They just accept that that is the way life is. And as well as accepting that's the way life is, they suggest in some of the research we've seen and in what we've heard, a perception that they feel unworthy of support because they've been smokers, because they maybe haven't looked after themselves in the way that they've been expected to as they've got older. And this is very much reflected in research with breathless people in the Breathe Easy groups. Stigma and shame is a large part of how people feel about their breathlessness. They find it shameful, they find it embarrassing. And in a film that we made for our exhibition that went along with the project, our Breathe Easy colleagues comment, it's not very glam when you sound like a set of bagpipes. The sound of difficult breathing is not easy to listen to. And there are cultural associations with it. Now, this is a rather jokey slide, but you will note here, this is Darth Vader, for those of you who are maybe fans of the Star Wars films. You'll notice how the dark side is associated with heavy breathing in Darth Vader's character. And as Davina Quillivan, who's written one of the few books on the issue of breathlessness within, or breathing within cultural context, Breath in Cinema was her book, she says breathing elicits feelings of unease that may haunt the viewer long after the film has ended. The sound of heavy breathing is very much associated with danger and with fear. And I think another element to this is the prevalence of the relationship between prevalence and research funding, particularly in the UK here. I suspect this might be the same in other places. You'll note the size of the prevalence of respiratory disease as opposed to cardiovascular disease and cancers, and the difference in research funding. And this is one reason why people with problems of breathlessness in the UK, the death rate from respiratory disease has not shifted in a decade, whereas that from cardiovascular disease has reduced significantly over a period of 10 years in comparison. And I think this is largely because of investment and interest in research in order to bring about changes to management. So all in all, breathlessness is a poor relation. We don't pay much attention to it as people, although increasing interest in mindfulness training and the context of COVID now is changing. For people who are breathless, social life is difficult, it's stigmatized and poorly supported. So yes, more attention is being paid, but largely in relation to COVID recovery itself. Already there are rehabilitation services to support people with long COVID, and that is important. But what about those people who have been living and dying with COPD or pulmonary fibrosis for 20 to 40 years? So in this very final section, which I think I've got a bit of time for, I just want to signal what it is that a medical humanities project like Life of Breath could actually achieve to try to improve this situation. What are the kinds of things that we are doing in relation to the kinds of themes that we have, that I've been exploring here? And the first one I think to look at is looking at the experience and the cultural exploration. One of the things that we've been working on quite hard in the last while is producing a book that charts the cultural story of breath from the Greeks to the present day across literature. There's been very little attention paid to this, as I said a bit earlier, in critical literature. And we're about to produce this book that came about as a result of an international conference we heard a couple of years ago. But the other thing that I think was really and this is all about the attempt to articulate what breathlessness means and feels like for people. You remember I said when talking about the actual experience of breathlessness that people found it difficult to articulate. And here's an example of one of the poems written as a result of our writer in residence project that we ran with people with Breathe Easy in the Breathe Easy groups that we were working with. And this is Jill Gladstone who's given me permission to show this, that reflecting in the poem, do we have the words? Do we have the thoughts? Do we have the language? Do we have the courage to be able to express what this has been like for us? And the gratitude of this group for actually having the opportunity to express what it's been like for them is really important. Now, the other issue is trying to open out what this experience is like to the general public. And we held this exhibition, Catch Your Breath, and my colleague Sarah McCluskey is in the room right now, and she was largely responsible for setting up this exhibition, which was held in Durham, in London, and in Bristol. And you'll notice the link there takes you to an online version of the exhibition that you might wish to explore. And as well as that, in terms of the political, we went and had some meetings with the chair of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on Respiratory Health to try particularly to push for a change, an awareness of the lack of support funding for the problem of breathlessness. And just turning briefly to the last issue, which I think is really important. This is a picture of one of our Breathe Easy groups and some of our researchers. And one of the key things we did was to try to tackle the problem of people not stepping forward to take up management options. And here, what we wanted to do with this group was to try to think about setting up a dance program with them. And the reason for that was that many people don't take up the opportunity to undertake pulmonary rehabilitation. You'll see from this diagram, for every 100 patients referred for pulmonary rehabilitation in this study, only 42 completed it. And the reason we wanted to suggest this was, going back to language, pulmonary rehabilitation, the language of that does not resonate well with people with breathlessness. The word rehabilitation has connotations of drug rehabilitation, of pulmonary is a complex clinical word. The life histories of people with breathlessness didn't include going to a gym, but may have included going to a dance club on a Friday or a Saturday night. And one other issue of, you'll notice I referred early on to the gentleman who spent most of his time sitting in his chair, this vicious cycle of inactivity. As people become breathless, they want to avoid breathlessness, so they do less activity, they become weaker, their respiratory muscles don't work so well, they get more breathless. This vicious cycle. So what could we do to try to do something about this? Well, we proposed the language of dance puts up fewer barriers. Previous life experience doesn't involve a gym culture, but might involve dance experience. Dance involves awareness of the whole body and may improve interoceptive awareness and the sense of the body as something that you can enjoy and enjoy the movement of. So we set up a research project with our colleagues in the Breathe Easy group in the city of Darlington. We ran a dance program. We took some quantitative and qualitative research results from it, and we've just published it now in the BMJ Open Respiratory Research. So this is again an important step for medical humanities to publish in some of these clinical journals, but in a medical humanities way. And what were the results? Well, you can see from this Moodle here, big aspects of it: joy, friendship, laughter, movement, stretching, fun, just happiness and inspiration. The kinds of joy and fun that people got from doing this activity together, as opposed to pulmonary rehabilitation. It wasn't a gym situation, it wasn't a competitive situation, but it was just great fun. And the interim results showed that there were improvements in strength and mobility. Dance was fun and enjoyable. And it was feasible to deliver this particular project. And here were some of the particular results that we got from the quantitative work. And the responses, just again emphasizing what great fun it was, how people got a lot out of the exercise, how their exercise improved. So I think it is really important that we pay attention to what it is a medical humanities project can actually lead to at the end of making these hypotheses about what's the problem. Where does that lead us to practically in terms of having an input into management? But of course now, and at the end of this particular project, people were very keen to keep it going. But now, of course, as this picture implies, people with breathlessness are now shut away, are fearful, suffer from this entity that's now been called Coronaphobia. And it's very, very difficult. We're looking a little bit at how people who've been involved in some of these support groups are now beginning to cope with the problem of being shut away again. And our dance crowd are actually meeting online. They're maybe not doing as much dancing as they were, but they're still meeting, they're still socially connected. And I think it's very, very important that we work towards trying to open out these issues and seeing how we can manage them. And just as I come to the end, I think I've learned a lot as a clinician and as a medical humanities project person doing this project about chronic illness. And I think we have to be aware of a different way of dealing with chronic illness, like breathlessness, like COPD, like pulmonary fibrosis. Chronic illness and these sort of symptoms are not going to be away. They're not going to go away. They're not going to be solved. There's no bad magic bullet that's going to get rid of it. Biomedicine tends to think of the body as a machine that can be fixed. But as the anthropologist Tim Ingold says, we need to dismantle that machine. We need to think of humans, not in terms of what they are, but of what they can do. And what a medical humanities approach brings in is a wider perspective on what that can do might mean. Other possibilities, other directions for life can start to open out. What's needed is a change of orientation from those of us who work with people with chronic breathlessness or illness, and illness, from an approach that focuses on outcomes to one that is concerned with process, with engaging people in new ways of being and enjoying their bodies, like dance, like singing for breathing, or another approach that we've researched and supported. And in this way, as Ingold goes on, we can think of ourselves not as beings, but becomings. That is, not as discrete and preformed entities, but as trajectories of movement and growth. As some doors close, we want to work with people to find other doors and help to open them up. I'd like to thank the entire team on Life of Breath for their work, particularly the team in the Dance and Breathe Easy group who worked with us on the dance project. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Jane, for a rich and very interesting presentation that has brought together a number of themes that have been touched on, but elucidated them in a very kind of interesting and specific way. I'd like to invite Chisomo to start us off on the questions, and I do recognize that there are a couple of questions in the chat, which I will get to. But for now, Chisomo, I wonder if you could open our discussions. Thank you.
Where do we even begin? I can start by just saying thank you, Jane. That was so marvelous, and I've been following the Life of Breath project through some of your colleagues for some time, and there's just so much that I've learned today that I didn't know, the activities that I was not aware that took place, but also some of the outcomes, the different forms of dance and the way the body moves. This is absolutely wonderful. So I want to first thank you for a very engaging and wonderful presentation. You know, I think where I wanted to begin was what you opened up with about this critical thought about our breath and what this pandemic has meant for redefining breathlessness and breath in sort of the public domain. And one of the questions that I had, you know, and I'm totally avoiding being political, but I'm going to just open up with one statement that was made when many world leaders had declared that this epidemic was going to be led by science. And what we found very quickly, that actually the discussions that were coming from the streets, whether it was from Black Lives Matter or from anti-mask protesters, was that it was actually very enriched in philosophical discussions of what you said about perceptions of being stifled. And so I wanted to maybe discuss a little bit about that, about, you know, tying into the universal right to breathe, these kind of two contradictory aspects of who has the right to breathe: the people who feel that their liberties are being jeopardized or by wearing masks, versus the social inequalities that were revealed even that to be very prevalent because of COVID. So I thought maybe that'd be a great place to kind of to look at, is, you know, led by science, but actually we seem to be led by philosophical arguments about freedom and the right to breathe.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think, you know, it's certainly the case that this COVID epidemic has opened that up significantly. But I feel very strongly that, you know, there are certain groups that the COVID epidemic is directing attention to, and there are still loads of groups who continue to be marginalized and forgotten about. And there's almost I have almost a concern that COVID, because it's so prevalent, it's so there, it's so important at the moment, that these groups are going to get pushed even further underground. And absolutely, we all, you know, one of the things that's coming out significantly actually for us in looking at the experiences of people who are even more stifled by this, you know, we've got COVID, but we've also got the fact that they've got COPD and other problems. It's very much down to context, down to where do you live, what kind of space do you inhabit, how easy is it for you to get out and about. And if somebody, for instance, in Glasgow lives 3 stories up in a tenement flat and has no garden, then their lives are much more stifled and smothered than it would be if you've even got a small garden and you're able to talk to your neighbours over the back wall and that kind of thing. So I do think, well, I know I'm verging more on the political here than I am on the sort of philosophical, but I think that breath has become this kind of touchstone for the kind of, also if we move into the post-colonial discussions, which I'm not an expert on by any manner of means, but that sense that there are communities within our society whose views, whose experience are ignored and stifled, and that's another thing that's been clear in the UK recently with the problem of the Windrush generation who came over from the West Indies and whose experience has just been ignored and stifled. So I think there's been a huge value to opening out that metaphorical notion of whose lives matter, whose voices are being heard, whose breath is in the mix, as it were, in that social space. But I also think we have also to bear in mind the kind of millions of people in all of our countries, I think, who have been living with this problem of breathlessness for tens and tens of years without anyone paying attention to their problems either. And I sense it's a bit like the debate with long COVID and people who've had ME or persistent physical symptoms for years. There's a sense, oh yeah, suddenly everyone's paying attention to long COVID, but what about the problem of ME? What about the problem of persistent physical symptoms that others have been experiencing, and not a lot of attention being paid to that? So, you know, I think we have to be aware that not everything is about COVID. And although this has raised attention to particular issues, but I'd be interested to hear other people's views.
Mm-hmm. I found that very interesting because you gave a very comprehensive list of issues that were also pertinent: smoking, indoor air pollution, outdoor air pollution, cooking, inhalation out from outdoor stoves, and deforestation and the effects of the air quality for people. So I think that's quite a comprehensive list of those issues that affect. I think maybe were there any other questions that came up from this discussion? I just don't want to hog the question space.
Thanks. So, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think what's been interesting in both your engagements with us is exactly how also that these ideas and thoughts and central questions and the interconnectedness between our shared breaths, or when our breaths are not able to be shared, or forced breath or violation breaths, have been picked up so frequently throughout the course of the symposium, both in the creative works and in the discussions. And also those moments, you know, Jane, you spoke about that moment of the joy that can come from using or finding our breaths in different ways, and how that's been picked up in many ways as well. There are some questions that I'd like to just share with you, Jane, and then I'd also like to invite after that any others on the floor to please raise their hands if they do want to speak. Gabriella asks, what were the cohort age group studied? Did age matter in your research? And have ICD classifications and breathlessness categorization perpetuated the invisibility of the lived experiences of people? So that's the first question. Jay, thank you for your question, which is about the forms of music and rhythm that worked for the dancing sessions. Jay, when the recordings are up and running, one of Jane's colleagues, Cheyenne, actually took us through one of those workshops and addressed a lot of those questions. So when we've got those up and running, I'd invite you to go back and you could actually experience the whole process of it. We ended up with a lot of laughing and giggling at our lack of rhythm, or rhythm as it were, with our freestyle dancing in that process. Yeah. So please do go back. So yes, Joan, I wonder if you could pick up Gabriella's question, and if anybody else would like to, just raise their hand. Thank you.
Gabriella's question. Yeah, Gabriella, I don't know, you sound like you know about particular kinds of research. This interestingly, owing to the fact that it got published in BMJ Open Respiratory, was very much a pragmatic research. So talk of cohorts is probably difficult for me to say, because we did this piece of work completely in collaboration with the Breathe Easy group. So we worked with them and basically took whoever wanted to step forward to undertake the class from that group. Now, it was only a small group of around a dozen people doing this dance session week on week, and the numbers varied because people would fall off a bit. Most of them were in their late 60s to late 70s. So I think that's just a reflection of the nature of the group that we were working with, because it was mostly retired people, but also the nature of the conditions, which were of chronic long onset. What I think was very good about this is that this particular group, there was a bias there, because they had invested in their own exercise capacity already by being part of another sort of gym-related active group. But the dance really took it a bit further for them, particularly in terms of the investment and the wish to continue the exercise. And I think one of the key things with pulmonary rehabilitation is, even if somebody undertakes it, the continuation of the investment in exercise thereafter is the problem. And this is one of the reasons why I talk about process rather than outcome. What you're trying to do is to get a lifestyle change, not just a treatment, which is what pulmonary rehabilitation might be. You've got an input and then you want an output. No, what we're looking for with chronic illness is a lifestyle change, is an investment in continuing access to exercise, continuing investment in that exercise. So I think that's what we had. As for ICD classification, I'm not sure if I can answer that question. I mean, would you like to make a comment on that? What's behind your comment there? Are you able to speak?
Hi, thank you, Jane, for for actually responding. Yes, I am in research. I work in the psychiatry department at Stellenbosch University. Yes. But the reason why I asked that question was that, is it our language or the way we categorize people in the respiratory space, is that part of the reason why that they are invisible? Therefore, I thought of this idea of categorization, because even my work is a lot to do with validation studies, and the way we label people, often people then associate with that disorder or disease, and it continues a illness identity. So therefore, I asked the question, do you think our biomedical categorization is the reason why people are actually, that's why there's this long idea with being invisible?
I think that's a brilliant comment, and one that really came up for me through the research is because one tends to think of clinical cultures as being rather amorphous, that there's one clinical culture, but I discovered with medicine that there are very many. So with breathlessness, there seem to be very many. And one thing that I noticed in particular is that there's a big distinction, I think, particularly between clinical specialists in respiratory medicine, whose main aim is to identify the underlying disorder and name it. So is this COPD? Is it pulmonary fibrosis? Is it something else? And then get at that and think, how do I treat that? And there's a distinction there between that and people, for example, in palliative care, who are less concerned about what the actual diagnosis is, and are much more concerned to think about the symptom of breathlessness. Now, the symptom of breathlessness, obviously, is what matters to the individual suffering from it. So in a way, when we did our study, people weren't coming up and telling us, well, my breathlessness is because I've got X, although we did know what kind of conditions people had. They were just interested, my breathlessness is like this, and what can we do to help it? And I think one of the issues with the clinical approach, the clinical specialist approach, is less attention tends to be paid to the actual fact of the symptom rather than naming it in a particular kind of way. Very often the naming doesn't necessarily get us any further. The fact is somebody has got chronic breathlessness. What can we do to support people living with that, rather than trying to deal with the underlying cause, which is often very difficult to do? So I think that's a very, very good point. And I think we have to watch our language and our categorization. And yeah, Jade's question. Jade, please do feel free to have a look at the paper which Sean Williams also contributed, that we've just come out on we've tweeted about it today, actually, so it's just been published online. But Sean wrote the section dealing with I mean, I'm not a dancer, but Sean, really it was as I said in the paper, we were very concerned to be aware of where the people in the group were coming from. What was the music they enjoyed? What did they feel they could move to? And of course, there were the practical issues of not having too fast a beat, because you can't really kind of move around to a sort of very fast beat if you've got this problem. So Sean was fantastic and worked very closely with Vic, who also delivered the classes, to look at the kinds of genres that would work, the kind of music that would work, and particularly she used rock music, Motown, Northern soul, and some classical stuff. So it was great, and we've done some of it with her. But it's great. It was great fun. So but it's very much important, because I think one of the things about dance is that it crosses. Of course, people have different dance cultures across all cultures and countries, and this can fit in with whatever group might like to do. So we want it to be prescriptive about what kind of dance moves you might want to undertake.
Okay, thank you. We did start slightly late, so I'm going to give us a little more space, also because it seems like there is an interest and questions coming in. So Jane, I hope you and Chisholm are okay with a little more time. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to read. Dee has posted a question and asking if you could comment further on the concept of unseen suffering in the context of disability, and specifically people who are struggling with unseen disabilities such as learning disabilities and neurodevelopmental challenges such as autism. And she's particularly interested in relevance to the discussion on interoception, exteroception, and proprioception. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes.
And then Okay. Oh, thanks, Jade. And then Jade, I'll hold that question and just in case there's any other questions. Otherwise,
Okay.
we'll come back to Jade's question was about the role of music and emotion and personal connections. And also just to kind of throw in one of the other things that's come up a lot is also the joys of singing. And there are people who are in the room now who have spoken and in some cases have done an online presentation around the significance of the breath used in the space of singing. So it's just an interesting thing to bear in mind that there is both the breath of movement and the breath of the movement of the vocal space. But I wonder if you could, just pick up on Dee's question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Dee, that's quite a complex question. I think it's interesting in relation to the work that my colleague, her name's gone out of my head probably because I'm tired, works at University of Sussex. She's done some work on autism and interoceptive awareness. We've drawn on some of her work to think. Sarah Garfinkel, thank you, Sarah. Great, she's reminded me. Sarah Garfinkel's work on autism and interoception, and we looked at this in particular because what you're saying about unseen suffering, I cannot comment on neurodevelopmental challenges or autism. I have no expertise in those areas at all. But in respect of the problem of breathlessness, this connected to our exploration of the so-called problem of symptom discordance. And this relates to your question, I think, because the problem of symptom discordance, that is the fact that measured breathlessness doesn't equate with the experience of it, it is connected to the fact that in breathlessness, people with chronic breathlessness often have poor interoceptive awareness, and that often is associated with the fact that they suffer from additional problems such as depression and anxiety, which seem to disconnect awareness from the body, as well as the problem of breathlessness making people less active and less aware of their bodies. So I do think that one of the things that we work quite closely with a neuroscientist in Oxford who's very interested in the relationship between interoceptive awareness and breathlessness. And I think this is an emergent field and something that we really need to explore a little more clearly, because I think it speaks to the disconnect between what clinicians can notice through the kinds of questioning and the kinds of models and the kinds of ways of measuring that we have of getting at experience. And this is a key theme within my institute, to try to improve models of human experience and understanding that would enable us to uncover some of this unseen suffering and some of this unseen experience of illness. And so I think it's a really important point. And I think interoceptive awareness is a really important element about this, to understand how it is that people experience their bodies in particular kinds of ways in the context of particular conditions, and how those conditions affect that experience of sensing your own body, and the extent to which you're able to report that to an external person who may then be able to help you or otherwise. So that's not a real answer to your specifics, but I hope it gives some sort of context to it.
Okay, we're slightly over now, so those who do need to go, but I did want to give Shisomo one last chance to raise another point, and then Jane, any final thoughts or comments from you before we free everybody into the, well, colder, damp over there and warm sunlight for most parts of here.
Oh, is that my turn to start, or
yeah?
Okay. There was a question that came up about unseen disabilities and chronic illness, and it tied into something which I also found fascinating, and I don't have an answer to, but I thought it'd be wonderful just to explore a little bit more, because it came about when you were talking about the sounds of difficult breathing, labored breathing, and I was thinking about snoring and sleep apnea. And it brought me to a question about shame. So a lot of what happens, as you mentioned, with invisible illness, for example, walking to the parking lot and no one knowing that this is someone with an invisible illness, there's a lot of public shaming and shaming that goes, private shame that is carried. So I didn't know if there was So there was some literature, some things that had come about in your research with participants that had come up either with specific forms of shame, such as fat phobia, or perceptions of lack of control in the body, and how people perceived themselves, or how the public perceived labored breathing from these bodies. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people are interested and are able to view the exhibition material, we've got some excellent film material that speaks to some of those issues on that website. And I think my colleague Luna Dolezal, that some of you may know of, is doing a fantastic project based at the University of Exeter on shame in medicine at the moment. And I'm part of Luna's steering group. And I think that's a really important exercise. One of the things that struck us very forcibly is we started to, you know, the big thing that everyone talks about, of course, is stigma, the extent to which people are stigmatized in relation to this problem. But actually, once we started to introduce this notion of feeling ashamed to the groups we were working with, it really resonated in a way that the notion of stigma did not, which was in some ways upsetting as well as really interesting, because that dreadful sense that, you know, if people feel stigmatized, they feel, well, that's being done to by somebody else. But shame is something you're doing to yourself. You're feeling ashamed by the fact that this is happening, and that's an awful thing. And I think one of the achievements I hope that the exhibition has and the project has achieved is to make people feel less ashamed, feel more robust about the fact that this is a condition that they have, that they should not have to kind of hide behind closed doors about it. And I think it's really, really important that medical humanities projects are able to speak to that sort of experience. Yeah.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for the comments. I see Gabriella's put some, yes, Gabriella, nerd moments are always welcome on any of these spaces, so no worries there at all. So now it falls on me to do the final thanks and to also tell you about some of the remaining events for the last, well, 2 days essentially. I also want to extend my heartfelt thanks to the entire team that's been involved in organizing and putting this together. Shamu, who's done all our internet work and our website, and specifically Charlotte, who has, I think, sent more emails and WhatsApp and text messages than anybody should humanly be able to do. And Nawazi and I are deeply grateful for the very amazing team we've had around us, and also the very amazing participants that we've had. There is a very specific moment. I think there is no way to speak about breath without speaking about that, which is political, and you know, the kind of structural inequalities have been raised really frequently, and you know, just in terms of the practicalities of how that plays out, even in something like a symposium, we've had colleagues from other countries who've not been able to connect because of, you know, digital connections. And Shasoma, you jokingly said about, you know, having spent so much time in Malawi, the difficulties of getting online, but those are very real concerns when it comes to the ideas of what we can and can't do in a post-COVID world, or in a existing COVID world, because these technologies, of course, are mediated by those experiences. But the extension of these have also the kind of inabilities to breathe or to have breath taken from one have also been played out with others of our participants. So one of the creative works that was meant to be going up this week was with a collaboration between a South African artist and photographers and creative artists in Egypt. And the studios that were involved in creating the work experienced raids, and several of the people were arrested. The South African person was deported. So the ideas of to be able to breathe into being one's capacity to critique or to speak or to create work has been mediated in very real ways in a number of the instances of just people involved in this. So I want us to hold those thoughts and the thoughts of those who are having to experience this on a daily basis and all the time, But mostly, I want to thank everybody for sharing your insight, your wisdom, your creative work, your time, and your energy. And I'd like to invite you to come and celebrate and explore some of the remaining pieces that are about to go up. There's a really lovely creative work called Womanifestos, which is an imagining of a world where the body, the queer body, the black body, the female body, the pregnant body, the living body, the breathing sexual body might exist in a different space. We have fragments, we have another splicing together of a series of videos that come from the Tupumue project around breath and breathing and air pollution. We have another series, a final series of images called From the Lockdown Diaries, which will also be going up. And we would also really love to invite you, because it appears the skies have cleared in Gauteng, to a sunset concert, which will be happening on Friday at Johannesburg sunset time, and we will send out the links for that to everybody who has been a participant or has signed up. We are hoping very much to be able to live stream that, so as long as there's no lightning or rain, we are hoping that we will share with you Nolwazi's rooftop and the experience, the lovely skills and capacities of the musicians who will be performing for us. So yeah, the last thing I have to say is thank you for your input, your thoughts, for breathing with us, for shaking out old breaths, hopefully for taking new breaths, and for sharing safely our breaths in these virtual spaces. Thank you very much to everybody.
Just want to say a big thank you. Cheers, guys. I'm trying to move things around to see you on Friday.
Excellent.